Welcome to Season 3, Episode 9, Chronicles of UK Salafism and Insider Perspective. The year in focus on this occasion will be 2018, and at the time of recording this in 2020, we have witnessed the exponential increase in the use of social media. And so it's a good place to start with the WHO announcement on the 2nd of January 2018, in where they classified gaming addiction as a mental health condition. On the 11th of January, President Donald Trump, caused worldwide controversy by referring to African countries as shithole countries. And that was during an immigration meeting. As an aside, it's interesting that the US and other former colonial entities that raped the African continent could now refer to it in such derogatory terms. So it's apt that I refer to a report that came out on the 7th of February in which DNA analysis of a Cheddar Man, the UK's oldest complete skeleton, revealed that he had dark skin and blue eyes. He was in actuality black. And I'll quote from that report. The first modern Britons, who lived about 10,000 years ago, had dark to black skin. A groundbreaking DNA analysis of Britain's oldest complete skeleton has revealed. It was initially assumed that Cheddar Man had pale skin and fair hair, but his DNA paints a different picture, strongly suggesting he had blue eyes, a very dark brown to black complexion, and dark curly hair. And the source of this report was quoted from the Guardian newspaper on the same date, the 7th of February 2018. On the 13th of March, National Geographic magazine admitted that its past coverage was racist, and it made this acknowledgement in marking 50 years since the death of Martin Luther King. On the 18th of March, we saw another killing of an African American, Stephon Clark, who was shot 20 times by police in his grandmother's backyard in Sacramento, California, during a vandalism investigation. A few days later, on the 24th, hundreds of protesters then shut down a special meeting that was convened at Sacramento City Hall to investigate this police shooting. We are in 2020, as I've highlighted while preparing this particular episode, and the disproportionality of shootings of black people continues to be an issue. And I'm highlighting this at this point because we hear dissenting voices from amongst the black communities that are trying to minimize the significance of this, in that they refer to the majority of killings of individuals at the hands of the police are in actuality white citizens. But that comes as no surprise because the predominant ethnicity is white people. They also highlight, in an attempt to diminish the impact of and the devastation that is wrought amongst black communities, that the number of shootings of innocent individuals at the hands of the police have almost halved over the last 20, 30 years. Again, I reiterate, this is an attempt to diminish focus and significance of this particular issue, in the same way that we hear other voices highlighting that all lives matter, white lives matter, in an attempt to diminish the Black Lives Matter cause. Referring to nature and the environment at this point, on the 19th of March, we saw the world's last male northern white rhino, 45-year-old Sudan, die in Kenya. And this may not register as significant news for many who are listening. However, those who can recall and recount the 60s and 70s and growing up in those times as young individuals, there was never any concern regarding such wildlife, elephants, rhinos, giraffes, there was never a fear or concern that these creatures would face extinction 20, 30 years later. On the 21st of March, an African trade deal was agreed by 44 countries in Kigali, Rwanda, giving some hope that there would be unity amongst the African nations on the continent. A few days later, on the 26th of March, hope, excitement, and unity was shared by many black people across the world with the release of Black Panther, which became the highest grossing superhero movie in America, earning $631 million. On the 18th of April, we were to see the movie shown in Saudi Arabia as it reopened its cinemas after 35 years. I will refer now to the first of a few articles written in 2018, and the first of them being on the 2nd of April, entitled Maajid Nawaz, From One Extreme to the Other. And I decided to write this article due to some very controversial statements he made on radio, LBC News, of which he was a host and continues to be in 2020. And I'll quote from that article, and that should suffice in highlighting what the issue actually was regarding his statement that caused offence to not only Muslims but Christians as well. Quoting, "As millions of Christians around the world prepared to celebrate Easter, among the most significant events in their calendar, another controversy ignited debate around a fundamental tenet that not only applies to Christianity, but the other Abrahamic faiths of Judaism and Islam as well. Pope Francis is alleged to have claimed bad souls are not punished and that a hell doesn't exist. Under the subheading Agent Provocateur, I mentioned as follows. Nawaz weighed into the above-mentioned controversy by featuring it for discussion during his Good Friday slot on LBC. What was particularly revealing for some, but confirmation for others, was his declaration of disbelief in the religious concept of an afterlife, the associated reward or punishment in particular, and the existence of hell. As one professing to be a reformed and liberal Muslim, Nawaz expressed a view contrary to a key article of faith relating to a judgment day after which the final destination is either heaven or hell. And I quoted him as follows. How can anyone in this day and age, any person of intelligence, believe in a literal burning hellfire? And so I hope the Pope did say this. He continued, and now he's done this great thing of denying a literal burning fire of hell that goes on forever and ever. I think that's a good step in the right direction, but some conservative Catholics are outraged. They're accusing him of heresy and saying that he should be removed. Quoting from the Bible, Nawaz then questioned, what kind of eternally merciful God creates an eternal burning pit of sulfur in which your skin is roasted alive? This hellfire business cannot be literal, so I for one welcome the Pope's move. And then after quoting related verses from the Quran, Nawaz exclaimed while stifling laughter, you cannot in all reasonableness in this day and age believe such stories. And so thank you, Pope Francis. It's high time Muslims did the same thing and moved from a literal definition of burning fire to a more humane, humanistic and metaphorical chastisement. Close quote. I don't need to elaborate on the significance of these statements and their outlandishness. And my article continued to address that from a theological perspective and also a socio-cultural one as well, highlighting some of my concerns for Nawaz in the event of extremists getting hold of these statements. I received an email on the 5th of April from a Home Office official researcher in international research analysis, in which she approached me because she quoted and stated she was writing a report for a cross-government policy audience which seeks to understand the diversity of the Salafi movement in the UK. Continuing with quoting her, I have read some of your work with great interest. I'm keen to ensure this report accurately considers the nuances of the Salafi movement, and I'm conscious that drawing on the work of academics will provide a valuable insight into the complexities of Salafi Islam and conversion to Islam more broadly. I would very much value the opportunity to speak with you. I'll end the excerpt of that particular email there, and I brought this to highlight once again, as I've done throughout these episodes and these series, that the focus on Salafism, on Salafiyya, was such that academics wanted to obtain a correct understanding, because the view and perspective that it was a precursor to violent extremism and in itself was non-violent was now being challenged. And there were continual voices, albeit a minority, including my own, that pushed back against that narrative, which had been fed to the government at the time and the previous government by liberal entities like Quilliam, Henry Jackson Society, Policy Exchange, and were now receiving some concern due to their inaccuracy and due to the inherent bias that underpinned such liberal narratives. I will refer to another article written on the 11th of April, and the title of that was Amber Rudd's Denial, Was She Taking the P? Quoting my article, I stated, Amber Rudd dismissed claims on Sunday that police cuts were to blame for the rise in violent crime as she prepared to publish a new strategy to tackle the problem. She went on to acknowledge that although police faced new challenges resulting in increased investment for policing, quote from her, the evidence does not bear out claims that resources are to blame for the rise in violence. End of her quote. I continue to write, if 50 plus murders over a period of 100 days do not amount to sufficient evidence that police cuts have to some degree contributed to this current crisis, it will be interesting to hear from Rudd as to what actually constitutes satisfactory proof. End of quote. She was the Home Secretary at the time and was making a number of blunders around policy as the UK witnessed that spike in murders within the first 100 days of 2018. My next article was on the 2nd of May, entitled Kanye West, The Nigger You Love to Hate. The last part being based on an Ice Cube song from the 90s. And this article addressed his outrageous comments regarding the transatlantic slave trade and the subjugation of the African peoples. And I'll quote what he stated here, quoting from him. When you hear about slavery for 400 years, for 400 years, that sounds like a choice. You was there for 400 years and it's all of y'all. I then mentioned as follows. The context surrounding this somewhat outlandish statement will be discussed shortly. However, it is important to examine the implications, though unintended, of such comments. To suggest that millions of slaves chose to remain subjugated for generations under what is considered among the worst human rights violations in history is to belie the suffering, oppression, and abuse they endured. Slavery's legacy continues to cast a shadow over black communities in the West today. It also ignores the inhumane economic, social, not to mention religious apparatus constructed by the Western, predominantly white world in order to perpetuate the slave trade and develop its societies. Closing quote. And I won't read any more of that particular article. We only have to look at where we are today internationally following the George Floyd public murder and other subsequent events to realize that this issue of racism continues to be pernicious, continues to be at the forefront of problems facing Western societies. And Kanye West's statement, for which he later apologized, is not unique in that it's coming from an African American, because we are seeing more African Americans of wealth, of middle class, speaking disdainfully about the poorer black communities, the rioting that they've been involved in, the looting that they've been involved in, and as I've mentioned earlier on, the diminishing of causes like Black Lives Matter by conflating them with other statistics and data. My next article was in that month as well, on the 15th of May, and it was entitled "A Symbol of Oppression, Rubbing Salt in the Wounds." And this was to do with the US recognizing Jerusalem as Israel's new capital. And I want to quote from that and quote President Trump's comments the year preceding 2018, in which he stated about something that's ever more pertinent and relevant today. We've just passed the 4th of July, and he's made statements concerning the Confederate statues and protecting the Confederate statues. So this statement in 2017, which I brought in this article of the 15th of May, went as follows. They're trying to take away our culture. They're trying to take away our history. These things have been there for 150 years, for 100 years. You go back to a university and it's gone. Weak people. Referring to his comments, I stated, President Donald Trump's words a little under a year ago echoed white nationalist and neo-Nazi sentiment against the removal of Confederate statues from public spaces due to their symbolism of America's great history. However, in contrast, many regarded them as being representative of a racist white supremacist past. Subsequent protests in support of and against their public display proved divisive, even fatal. Fast forward to the 14th of May 2018, the inauguration of the new US Embassy in Jerusalem and 70th anniversary commemorating the establishment of the State of Israel, to witness Trump's continuing trend to endorse not only racist but pro-Zionist policies that serve to further denigrate Palestinians. End of quote. So it was necessary to address the continued bigotry of the 45th president, and I did so in this article. Moving to June now, I want to refer to an email from the BBC representative Tobias Muller on the 19th of June, in which he wrote to me inquiring about the slashing of funds for street and how the Home Office is left with nobody to engage with due to their highly expansive definition of non-violent extremism. So I've referred to two email correspondence from the Home Office on the first occasion and the BBC on this particular occasion, showing the relevance of Salafis and Salafi input to the wider narrative. As I record this particular session, there's still a dearth of Salafi involvement in the wider societal landscape, should I say, for want of a better phrase. And in the conclusive podcast on 2019, which shall follow shortly, I will provide my synopsis and opinions as to why there's such a vacuum. On the 19th of June, I wrote an article to address a statement of a relatively well-known caller to Islam from the Pakistani community called Abu Ibrahim Hussain. And during Eid celebrations in Birmingham, he made a statement to the gathering Pakistani youngsters in which he told them to stop talking like they were black. And this caused a furore around the UK and even spread to America. Al Jazeera News picked up on the incident because of the polarization that occurred between black members of the Muslim community in the UK and South Asians. And I'll quote a small aspect of my article that went as follows. The recent Eid al-Fitr celebrations were tarnished for some of the black Muslim community in the UK due to inflammatory comments made by a well-known and respected speaker, Abu Ibrahim Hussain. His comments when addressing a group of predominantly Asian youth in Birmingham have since gone viral due to their offensive nature. Quoting his comments, "Brothers, we're not black. Let's stop talking like we're black. Let's talk in a decent way with decent manners." End of his quote. I continued. He has since endeavoured to apologise for making such comments. However, his repeated efforts to contextualise and subsequently criticise an element among the black Muslim population for having a victim mentality have diminished this attempt. I went on to describe the climate following such outlandish statements and the heated discussions that were occurring across social media, and also the revelation that colleagues that we had known for 10, 15, 20 years were defending or trying to minimize the impact of his statement and dismiss it as something quite insignificant. And those tensions between co-religionists that we'd known for so long continue up until this day, because it revealed to many from the black community an inherent bias at least, and racism at most, from individuals that we've known for so long. And jumping quickly to an email of the 7th of December that I received from a sister regarding this event, and she wrote to me and greeted me, "Assalamu alaikum Abdul Haq. I recently came across the scandal regarding Abu Ibrahim Hussein and his distasteful comment about blacks. I was initially outraged and disgusted, but was relieved to read your article on the matter. Do you know if any research has been carried out on the type of people who are likely to make such ignorant statements as the ones made by Abu Ibrahim? It would be interesting to find out. As from my experience, it's usually the ignorant, unexposed and uneducated Asians who come out with such nonsense." I won't cite the rest of her email for brevity's sake. However, unfortunately, we see that those who make such racist statements, whether South Asian, Arab, white or otherwise, often are educated and are willful and deliberate in uttering such racist statements. The issue of anti-black racism among Muslim communities, predominantly South Asian and Arab, continues today in June, July 2020. And it's opened a wound for black community members that is unlikely to be closed and healed for a very, very long time, because the diminishing of our defense and pushback continues, particularly since the George Floyd incident has opened these wounds again. Referring to conferences and workshops now, on the 27th of June, I attended a GRI IIPS conference in Manchester, in which I delivered a workshop to senior Nigerian military personnel entitled "Defense Against Terrorism, Kidnapping and Drugs, The Links." During the course of those workshops, I engaged with the military colleagues and personnel discussing strategies and tactics to deal with Boko Haram. For reasons of confidentiality, I will not elaborate further on that, but they were good sessions and mutually beneficial for them and myself. Referring to another incident that made national headlines, on the 19th of July, the Israeli parliament passed a controversial nation-state law giving only Jews the right to self-determination and relegating Arabs to special status. This was further endorsement of the apartheid that continued in that region. And on the 13th of September, a report came out from the Global Extremist Monitor, presented by Tony Blair, in which it claimed that Islamic extremism, which is an odd expression, religious extremism is the more accurate term to use, Islamic extremism by 121 groups contributed to 84,000 deaths in 2017. And I would hasten to suggest that this be taken with a pinch of salt, as I'm sure it was at the time, when bearing in mind the hypocrisy and double standards of this report when juxtaposed alongside state-sanctioned terrorism of Western governments that have killed countless more than the figure that was cited here. And also, Tony Blair has been intimated as a war criminal, unofficially of course, by many across the world. Move into the following month, and we saw that more than 80,000 Americans died of a flu epidemic during 2017-2018 winter period. This was the highest in 10 years according to health officials. And when we contrast that with where we are now in June, July 2020, the current coronavirus pandemic has caused 130,000 deaths and is still rising. And that's in the US alone. Another international event that caused consternation and controversy was the death of the murder of Jamal Khashoggi in the Saudi Arabian consulate in Istanbul, Turkey on the 2nd of October 2018. And the effects of that continue to reverberate today in 2020. And on the 6th of November, Prince Charles called slavery an indelible stain, but he stopped short of apologising during his speech while visiting Ghana. On the issue of apologies, there have been a few from institutions that have conceded that their wealth was based on the transatlantic slave trade, and they have made commitments of reparations to various bodies within society. And this has been countered by a number of individuals, a significant minority amongst the black population as well as the white, querying why reparations are necessary. And this is problematic to make such queries, because none were made when reparations were paid and awarded to the slave traders for giving up and abandoning their stock, their slaves at the time. And the reparations that were awarded to them following the abolition of the slave trade amounted to 40% of the UK's GDP. And repayment of that debt was not completed until 2015 using taxpayers' money. So it's slightly hypocritical, to say the least, that no resistance was made over this few centuries long reparations, but the moment reparations are requested for the descendants of black slaves due to the institutionalized racism, due to the systemic and structural racism that continues to perpetuate inherited poverty, these claims are shut down or challenged by those saying that, one, they're not necessary, and secondly, an apology is not necessary either. Moving to the 2nd of December, a slightly light-hearted moment for some. The Nigerian president, Muhammadu Buhari, denied that he had died and been replaced by a Sudanese imposter following his prolonged absence due to illness. And all I would say at this stage is that the less said about that, the better. Another conference and workshop delivered by me was on the 4th to the 7th of December in Astana, Kazakhstan again. And this was another UNODC conference entitled Rehabilitation and Reintegration of Violent Extremists, Returning Foreign Terrorist Fighters and Their Families. On that occasion, some of the statutory bodies discussed with me the possibility of rolling out a street-like organisation or entity to deal with these returnees. And so we discussed that in some detail following the conference and workshops. On the 5th of December, there was the US state funeral for the former President George H.W. Bush, father of George W. Bush. And we should reflect that this late president, George H.W. Bush, was responsible for launching Operation Desert Storm in 1990-1991 against Iraq. And the lasting and devastating impact of that initial invasion and incursion are still felt to this day in Iraq and across the region. And in conclusion, I'd like to refer to two remaining articles that I'd written in 2018, one on the 29th of August, and that was entitled "In the Name of the Father, Endemic Sexual Abuse Under the Guise of Religion." And then on the 30th of October, I wrote a similar article, "Hear No Evil, See No Evil, Covering Up Sexual Abuse While Blaming the Victim." In total, I'd written 7 articles that year. My final reference will be in regard to an article written by the Millie Chronicle on the 29th of December, in which it highlighted the report of an organisation called the Criminal Investigation Department of Kashmir, which revealed that only 3% of Salafis are radicalised, while 71% of terrorists belong to the Hanafi school of thought, Barelvi and Deobandi groups, and 23% of terrorists strictly follow Jamiat Islami. This organisation conducted an intensive study by monitoring 156 local youth who joined militant groups between 2010 and 2016. The 74-page report was accessed by the Indian Express newspaper by interviewing and speaking to the families, friends, relatives and acquaintances of the militants. So herein again is another report, this time non-Western based, from an Indian based research organisation and criminal investigation department, highlighting what Salafis have been stating and proffering for nearly 30 years, that Salafism is not a precursor to either non-violent or violent extremism and terrorism. It comes from other entities, and this report, I think, is an emphatic evidence to support that assertion from Salafis. In the final episode, I will discuss these particular aspects in more detail. Again, as I mentioned at the beginning of this episode, highlighting my own observations of the movement in the past 30 years and the possible trajectory for the future.